Let me just read these 10 verses in Genesis chapter 12. 2 weeks ago when I was here, we did 1 to 9, the call of Abram. God called him out of Haran, brought him into the land of Canaan. He asked him to leave his country, his family, his father's house, and come into a new land. And this week, we follow up that story. Here's Abram in the land, pretty much the first events that we have recorded. Once Abram gets there, it says, starting at verse 10, "Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came about when he came near to Egypt that he said to Sarai his wife, 'See now, I know that you are a beautiful woman. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, "This is his wife," and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say that you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that I may live on account of you.' And it came about when Abram came into Egypt, the Egyptians saw the woman was very beautiful. Pharaoh's officials saw her, praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Therefore he treated Abram well for her sake. He gave him sheep and oxen and donkeys and male and female servants and female donkeys and camels. But the Lord struck Pharaoh in his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Then Pharaoh called to Abram and said, 'What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go.' And Pharaoh commanded all his men concerning him, and they escorted him away with his wife and all that belonged to him." One of the things that I think gives the Bible a lot of credibility and separates it from every ancient document I know, and I do not know every ancient document, but I've read about many of them, the Bible shows the faults of its heroes. When you read other historical accounts, you read about Nebuchadnezzar outside the scriptures, perfect guy, powerful guy, super guy. You read about Pharaoh, you read about the ancient kings of Greece. All of them were perfect. The Bible's not that way. The Bible introduces us to some of the heroes, and then it shows us their weaknesses. I think it adds to the credibility of the Bible. We can read about the great successes of people, but we also read about their failures. And to be honest with you, I identify more with their failures than I do with their successes. I'm encouraged by their successes, but failure is not an unusual thing in a life of faith. And here we see people that had to deal with failure. When Abraham fails, I understand. I excuse him in my mind. I know why he did what he did. And I think that this week we see one of those instances too. In the beginning of chapter 12, Abram leaves everything behind. He leaves his country and his family and his father's house, and he goes to a land that he doesn't know. And now we see him again after he's in the land, and he's on the move again, but for a totally different reason. Not because God called him out and wanted him to go somewhere, but he was driven by the circumstances of his life. Verse 10, it says, "Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land." Can we see that first chart? I think this chart shows every journey of Abram, but you can see it goes from Ur of the Chaldees to Haran, about 600 miles. That's what we read about. That's where his father Terah died. After he died, God called Abraham. He goes from Haran down to Shechem, 400 miles. From Shechem, he goes to Bethel, another 20 miles. And then Bethel into Egypt, 225 miles. So you see that he's traveling some great distances, Abraham. When he made a decision to go to Egypt, that's a big deal. It was 220 miles. And estimating 20 miles a day, and the reason I say that is when Abraham went to Mount Moriah to sacrifice his son Isaac, it was 60 miles away from where they were living. And it says it took them 3 days, which comes out to approximately 20 miles a day. And that was just Abraham, Isaac, and the two servants. Here we have Sarai is there, there's some animals, and they probably didn't travel that fast, but we're talking at least a 3-week journey. He goes from Shechem down into Egypt, at least a 3-week journey. And there's many people that fault him, but it says that it was a famine, a severe famine, a famine. And the word in Hebrew that describes as severe is the word kavod. It means heavy. Sometimes it's used to describe God. When you talk about the glory of God, that word is kavod, heavy. He's heavy with holiness, heavy with glory. Here it was heavy, oppressing famine in the land. And when there was a famine in Canaan in those days, you didn't just go to a different grocery store. You're out of luck. I mean, it's a drought. That's what caused the famine. We are so far removed from that because we get food from all over, all different places. But in those days, when there was a drought, nothing grew and they had nothing to eat, literally. And that happened several times in the land of Canaan or the land of Israel. And when it happened this time, Abram decides he's going to go down into Egypt. And it seems, at first glance to me, it seems a little strange. Remember, God told him that he was going to bless him, take care of him, that he would become a great nation. He would make his name great. So if there's a famine and Abraham's going to die during the famine, how could his name become great? How could he become a great nation if he's dead? And if God promised to bless him or to provide for him, why wouldn't he just stay there and wait? We know Abraham did not know, so I excuse him on many levels for this, but remember when Elijah was hiding out in the wilderness, God had the ravens bring him food. Whatever it took, God could take care of it. Still can. But Abram, no food, I'm going down into Egypt. And that's what he thought was the best thing. And why would he go down into Egypt? Well, if you know a little bit about the geography, you come from Israel down into Egypt. Egypt had the great Nile River. There was always water in Egypt. Annually, the Nile River would overflow its banks and it would put soil on that people could plant their crops in. They had water to water the crops. It was a breadbasket in the ancient world. So when there was a famine, people went down into Egypt. And that's what Abram did too, just like everybody else did. So he goes down into Egypt, and as he's traveling down there, it takes him, 2 weeks, whatever it was, 10 days. He's thinking about different things. And it says, Moses writes, when it came about that he came near Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, see now, I know you are a beautiful woman. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. And they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say that you are my sister, so it may go well with me because of you, and that I may live on account of you. So let me put this into modern language here, what's happening. Abraham decides to go down there, and he says to Sarah as they just come into Egypt, Sarah, you're a real hottie. And when the Egyptian dudes take a look at you, they'll say, let's do away with her old man and take this babe for ourselves. They'll kill me, but they're going to let you live. So, my darling, please say that you're my sister, and this way I can chill out when we get in Egypt. It's pretty much what the story says. Slight paraphrase, but it's true. Sarah was the half-sister of Abram. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. I know you don't remember, but that's totally fine. That's why I'm saying it again. It's really true. That did happen. Technically, he was telling the truth, but the purpose of his telling the truth was to deceive someone. I had a big argument with one of my boys, I won't tell you which one, over if you're telling the truth and it deceives someone, is that a lie? Yeah. I don't know how else you could put it. Was he lying? Technically, no. What was the purpose? Make him believe something else. My mom does that a lot. She technically tells the truth, and she always thinks it's for a good reason. And sometimes you do it too. If you know somebody's in the hospital and they're not doing too well, and there's a problem at home, their mom, dad, sister, brother, all of a sudden gets in a bad accident, you don't go in there and go, hey, guess what happened? No, yeah, how's everything? Good. If you do this, it's okay. But, he's deceiving someone. He's trusting in his own scheme, in his own little plan. That's what he's doing. He's coming up with this little idea that he thinks is good. And, I don't know, can I excuse him on a human level? Yeah, the guy he was hungry, and he was scared. He didn't know what was going to happen. And the fact that he even brought up that the Egyptians would kill him, was part of their reputation. They weren't immoral. They wouldn't sleep with somebody else's wife. They'd kill the guy and then marry her. So it was a different kind of morality they had. But Abraham knows this, and that's why he said it going down there. He was afraid. But we see him now. First, he doubts that God could provide for him. That's why he got out of the land that was promised to him, to his descendants. It's going to be his land. He left there because he didn't think that God could provide for him there. And now we see as he goes into Egypt, he's doubting again that God could protect him. He believes that God will, but he gives a little insurance plan. To me, it always reminds me when somebody says, all we could do is pray. That's like all you could do? You mean the creator, sustainer of the universe, that you just approach him? That's all we can do. We've tried everything else. Let's try God as the last resort. This is what Abram's doing. I better come up with a little insurance, make sure I can go down there and come back. So that's what he does. And as we notice, as he goes down there, he's doubting his protection. There's something unique. In the first 9 verses of chapter 12, we read that Abram traveled twice. He went to Shechem and then in between Ai and Bethel. Both times when he arrived at those places, he made an altar and worshiped God. In these 10 verses, while the entire time he's in Egypt, no mention of an altar. I don't want to read like tons and tons into it, but he had time to stop and worship when he got to Shechem. He had time to stop and worship when it was between Ai and Bethel, but he didn't seem to take much time to worship when he got down into Egypt. There's no mention of it. And it made me think, because what I think is happening here is that as Abram leaves God out of one part of his life, he continues that practice as he goes on. And that's really a scary thing to me. He leaves God out of the provision, providing for him in Canaan. And then he leaves God out of his protection. And then he winds up leaving God kind of out of his day-to-day life. And that is such a pattern. And it's I don't know the right word, demonic, subtle pattern that happens with us as well. It's a little difficult to leave God out of the first thing. It's not as hard to leave God out of the second thing. And before you know it, God's out of everything. And that's what I think is happening to Abram. He's leaving God out, and he's moving a little bit further and further away. And it's a pattern that still happens today. So he gets down into the land, and this is what happens. Moses writes in 14, "It came about when Abram came into Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman, Sarah, was very beautiful. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. Therefore he treated Abram well for her sake, gave him sheep and oxen, donkeys, male, female servants, female donkeys, and camels." They get into Egypt, and Abram's fears proved to be correct. He was nervous, and it's true. The first thing I want to deal with, because a lot of people have a problem with this, is that Sarah was a very beautiful woman. When she went down into Egypt, she was 65 years old. She lived to be, now I want you to follow along with this, because there's a lot of logic here, okay? I know you're not expecting that, but she lived to be 127 years old, right? It's roughly half her lifespan. In the U.S. today, average lifespan for a woman is 81 years. So let's cut that in half, which would be true for Sarah. You're talking about 40 years old. Can a 40-year-old woman be beautiful? I have living proof, if you'll show that other picture I have. Sophia Loren at 40. She was my father's favorite after my mother. My father thought my mother was the most beautiful woman in the world, but after that, it was Sophia Loren, hands down. 40 years old. She's an exceptionally beautiful woman. That's what we're talking about Sarah. it says the woman was very beautiful. It's not a far-fetched idea. It's not some crazy mistake in the Bible. Or this woman was a very beautiful woman. And we all know people, some people don't look their age, some people don't age, not everybody ages the same way. And, she was an attractive woman. And Abram, when he said to his wife, you're pretty hot, he was right. Because they get down into the land, and what's the first thing that happens? It says that she was noticed to be beautiful by 3 groups of people. Now, I rarely use alliteration, which means beginning a list with the same letter or the same sounding word. And that's your word for the week, alliteration, to drop on your friends that don't come here. But there's 3 groups in here. It says, first, the people saw that she was beautiful. It said the Egyptians saw her. She was beautiful. The second thing were the princes, the officials of Pharaoh. They saw that she was beautiful. And finally, Pharaoh himself saw that she was beautiful. Now, a lot of people think that Abram's plan was not really a good plan. Say you're my brother, that it was totally out of self-preservation that he did that. But let me tell you what I think was really going on in his mind and in the culture of the day. What happened in that day, if somebody wanted to marry a woman, they would make a deal with the father. They had the bride price or the dowry. And they would go and talk to the dad. They'd work out whatever price was, whatever. And once the suitor paid that price, then he could marry. Since we don't know where he was, but he certainly wasn't with them in Egypt, Abram, the brother, the older brother, was the person who would have the right to negotiate the bride price. So Abram's thinking this as he goes down into Egypt. Listen, when they see that you're a beautiful woman, if they know that I am your husband, they're going to kill me so they can marry you. So, let's do this. You tell them that I'm your brother. This way, when they want you, they're going to start to negotiate with me. And what I could do is I can stall them for whatever reason until the famine is over and we can go home. I'm pretty sure that's what he was thinking about. I don't think that he was doing it because he was afraid. There's always some element of that. But it wasn't like he's going to throw his wife to the wolves so that he could be preserved. That's not really the picture. The picture is that he came up with this really cool scheme so that he could stall everything that was going to happen, and they could both go home. That's his plan. However, it never entered his mind that his wife was going to appeal to Pharaoh. Who would think such a thing? You're going down into this big kingdom, and Pharaoh, who rules all of it, what are the odds that he's going to see your little group that comes into the country and then pick your wife out of everybody else to be part of his harem? I think Abraham was stunned when that happened. But it makes an important point. And that is, we don't know at this point how God would have handled it, but we know one thing, that man's plans always fall short of God's plans. Abraham had this it was a good idea. He was no dope. I think it was pretty smart. You didn't get married in a week, 2 weeks. No whirlwind, go down to Vegas, get married. It wasn't like that. It took a little bit of time. And he figured he'd have a couple of months talking, he'd put something off, and, by the time it got serious and a little dangerous, they'd go home. But he never expected that Pharaoh would see his wife. And Pharaoh, who was a god in Egypt, didn't need to negotiate with anybody. Abraham never thought about that. No negotiations needed. Pharaoh saw something, he took it. Pharaoh saw someone, he took them. Abram's plan, shot. He must have been stunned because all of this happens very quickly. And in order to keep the real opponent in view here, Pharaoh, who is a god in Egypt, just imagine, Abraham's a foreigner. He comes into the country. He doesn't really know anybody. He doesn't have any family. He doesn't have any friends. He comes in there by himself. And who's his opponent? Pharaoh, a god in Egypt. And the way verse 15 is written in the Hebrew, it makes it very clear that it's Pharaoh, because verse 15 says this: Pharaoh's officials saw her, praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. It mentions it 3 times, but in the Hebrew, in each one of those phrases, the last word is Pharaoh. And he saw her, Pharaoh. And the officials of Pharaoh took her into the house of Pharaoh. So Moses makes it real clear. It's Pharaoh, Pharaoh, Pharaoh. He's the opponent. The god of Egypt is who this little foreigner is messing around with. It doesn't stand much of a chance. The whole plan of Abraham goes out the window, like almost immediately. I can't imagine what he was thinking then. And then it says that Pharaoh paid the bride price. He figured it out himself, whatever he wanted: the sheep, the oxen, donkeys, male, female servants, camels, everything. This is what he gives him, and Abraham becomes a very wealthy man because of this misunderstanding. So here we are. Abram, running away from the famine, comes down into Egypt, has this really cool plan. It all falls apart. Now his wife is in the harem of Pharaoh, and he's sitting around with all this wealth. Like, he must have been stunned that this is going on. And still, through all of this, we don't hear anything about the Lord. Nothing. And then in verse 17, it's the first time that God comes into this picture. It says, "But the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Then Pharaoh called to Abram and said, 'What is this you have done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister?' So I took her for my wife. Now then, take your wife and go." So now we see God come into the picture. Here, the word Moses uses is the word Yahweh, the personal name of God, the covenant name of God, the God who promised Abram he would take care of him. Now God enters into the picture. It seems that even if Abram has forgotten about God, that God didn't forget about him. And that is another great comforting thought. Abram forgot God, but God did not forget Abram. I don't know if you've ever had that situation in your life where you come up with a great scheme, or you get really desperate, you forget about God. He doesn't forget about you. And we see that he's in the background. All these things are happening. At the perfect time, he steps in. And it says that he strikes Pharaoh and his house with all these plagues. We don't know what the plagues are. It doesn't say. There's no clue from the words. It literally means stroke. He struck Pharaoh and his house with great strokes. It was plural plagues. There was more than one. It was like, you can't miss this. I'm getting your attention. The entire house of Pharaoh. Why the entire house of Pharaoh? Because they were all complicit in the deal. The women in the harem kept them there, Sarai there, the guard. Pharaoh's whole house was involved in this. He didn't do it on his own. He didn't go himself and get Sarai and bring him into the house. He had everybody take care of it. So the entire house of Pharaoh was struck with these many great strokes because of Sarai. And it said, when the God of Egypt met the God of Abram, he found out who the real God was. He knew for sure that something was going on. It tells us that Pharaoh knew that the plagues were because of Sarai. I don't know how he knew. She might have told him. He might have just figured it out. It might have been the type of... I have no idea. We don't know. All we know is that the message was very clear to Pharaoh that Abram's God was, if not the, certainly a real God, because he made his presence known. God promised, if you remember, that it was through Abram that all the families of the earth will be blessed. And he was talking about the coming Messiah generations down. And in order to protect that messianic line and keep it pure, he was not going to allow Pharaoh to get in there and mess around. So God made sure that he prevented him by bringing these judgments, these plagues on him. God separated Abram and Sarah through his power. And this is another thing I think is really important and real encouragement. A failure on the part of Abram did not cancel the promise of God. Isn't that, I find that real comforting. It's not dependent on his behavior. It's not dependent on our behavior. When we do not do as God wishes, all we do is we cut ourselves out of a blessing or expose ourselves to some kind of problem or hurt. It doesn't stop God's plan. It reminds me of Psalm 2 when it says, the nations rage. God sits on his throne and laughs. God has his plan. He's bringing his plan about. The only sad thing is if we are not part of it, if we're not obedient, we miss out. Abram missed out here because he forgot, God remembered. He didn't remember God's promise, but God did. And you know too, I shouldn't say you, let me say I know. Perhaps you've had the experience of sometimes forgetting to involve God in something, or not asking him when you should or how you should, and then he comes in and he does it anyway, and then how do you feel? It bothers me. I feel like a jerk. I feel sad. Why? I should know this by now. I should know that God is going to step in. That's what happened with Abram, I think. God said he'd take care of him. He forgot. He made this plan. God takes it into his own hands anyway. He keeps his promises even when we fail. And that's really important to remember. Abram failed, and we'll see he fails a couple more times. But God remembers his promises to Abram, and he fulfills the promises to him. Very important point. God made promises to the nation of Israel. Israel failed over and over again. And the reason that we can so easily see the failures of the nation of Israel is because that's the majority of Scripture. If they had one giant book that was about you or me, we would see a lot of failures. Bang, bang, bang. But God keeps his promise. Kept his promise to Abram. He kept his promise to Israel. And for us personally, the most personal thing is that God keeps his promises to us, even if we fail. And that's where the hurt or the embarrassment comes in. That, you messed up, but God loves you and he's going to do what he said anyway. He did it to Abram, does it for Israel, he does it for us. The promises of God are reliable. They are reliable, and we see that here because he steps in. And Pharaoh figured out the cause, and we don't know, but he asked Abram 3 questions. What is this you've done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister? So I took her for my wife. So in a sense, he's the injured party. I mean, I totally get that. However, I have no doubt in my mind that if Pharaoh knew that she was the wife of Abram, he would have killed him. No question. Why'd you do this to me? I'm just a hurt person. You took advantage of me. Oh, that's his wife. Why don't you kill that guy? Because I like his wife. So, is he the injured party? In a sense. Is he an innocent, nice guy? Not really. It just happened that Pharaoh was on the losing end of this deal. And we see when he asks Abram these 3 questions, the scripture doesn't record anything. He doesn't respond. He doesn't defend himself. I believe the reason is that he was real uncomfortable to be rebuked by an unbeliever. He behaved in a deceitful way, and somebody doesn't have a relationship with God saying, why do you behave that way? That's really convicting. I don't know if you've ever had that wonderful experience to be admonished by an unbeliever, but I had the pleasure a couple months ago. We were on a trip to Prague. We were in Denmark for a conference. We went to Prague, and Sharon's sister met us. We went after the conference. We went to Prague, spent the week there, and I love my sister-in-law. She's one of the most kind, generous people in the world. I love her. But she's not a believer in the God of the Bible. Doesn't believe. We're in Prague and get a phone call from my brother. We had a leak in the bathroom from a line from the toilet, some leak. I don't know what it was, but the very, 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 very nice part was we were gone for 8 days, and it was leaking for 4 or 5 days before anybody saw it, because we had somebody watching the dog, but it's in the master bedroom, so we had to wait till the master filled up, and then went into the whole bedroom, filled up, and started coming under the walls in the kitchen. So by the time the girl that's watching the dog saw it, it had already started coming out from under the cabinets in the kitchen and out in the hallway, and I was like going insane. You know, it's so frustrating. I'm like 8,000 miles away and my house is leaking. I want to see it. I want to shut the water. I want to be in charge of everything. And I'm complaining to Sharon and to my sister-in-law. I'm saying, you know, it's terrible. I should be there. I wish I was there. And she said to me, where's your faith? Don't you believe God can take care of this? Yeah. Yeah, but why can't I be there? And I totally get it. Totally get it, Abram. Like, you believe God can take care of it? Yeah, but I mean, I need to be there. Pharaoh says to him, you know, what, behave like this? If you're God? And it's the same kind of thing. Like, yeah, for God, how can you do such a thing? You can't. When an unbeliever rebukes you for something that you should be doing, you're speechless. You just feel bad. And I think that's what happened to Abraham. That's why he didn't say anything. Okay, so Pharaoh tells him to go. Just a couple of quick things. He has his men escort Abram out of Egypt. They're like bouncers in a bar, these guys. That's what they're like. You know, you cause a problem in the bar, you're out. And that's what Pharaoh did. I got a lot of problems here. He got the bunch of bouncers together. And look, you take this guy and make sure he gets out of Egypt. I don't want him here anymore. He was afraid of Abram, and he did not mistreat him because he saw what Abram's God could do. It already happened in his house. He didn't want any other play. He didn't know what was next, but he was going to find out. But he figured, this guy's bad news, get him out. So they took him out of Egypt. Okay, quick couple things. One of the things that makes the Bible unique, as I mentioned earlier, is that from other ancient literature, it shows the faults of his hero. Abraham was a hero in the faith, but he still had things to work out in his relationship with God. And that's one of the things that happens in our life as believers. Faith is an initial experience and an ongoing experience. We have the initial faith that brings us into a relationship with God, but we need to have an ongoing faith as we live our lives as followers of God. It's not a one-time only. It's a once and continuing experience. That's what Abram was learning. James tells us, consider it all joy, brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds, knowing the testing of your faith produces perseverance. That's what he's talking about with Abram. That's what he talks about with us. The hard time, consider it joy. It's not joy in the sense of, woohoo! Man, am I glad that thing leaked. I wish the whole house was filled with water. No, it's more like, can you trust me? Can you trust me? Can you trust me? I'm happy to say I failed that test after 30 years. I'm a human being like Abram. Abram was tested and his faith grew. We see it. So the testing, that is the joy. Our faith becomes stronger. Abram gained great wealth during his stay. And it seems like a positive thing. You know, he goes down into the land and Pharaoh gives him all this stuff and Pharaoh makes him leave with all the stuff he had. It seems really good. But without going too much into the future, it caused problems for him. In the very next chapter, he and his nephew Lot, remember we talked about how much Abram loved Lot, how he was in his family, how he adopted him, took care of him. Next chapter, they're both so wealthy they can't live together anymore. They have to split up because the wealth that Pharaoh gave them caused a rift in their personal relationship. So it wasn't just all blessing. Another thing, which I had not thought about before, it says that Pharaoh gave him male and female servants. That's one of the things that Pharaoh gave Abram for the price of his wife, which seems great. However, if you read in Genesis chapter 16, remember Sarah had no children. Her and Abram couldn't have children God promised him to be a great nation. And Sarah, I do not fault her for this. It was many years. She got frustrated that she had no children. So what did she decide to do? She decided that Abram should sleep with one of their servants so they could have a child, because she was given up on God. That's what she decided. You know who Abram slept with? Chapter 16, verses 1 and 2 says this. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. And she had, listen to this, an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. An Egyptian maid. Where do you think the Egyptian maid came from? It came from Pharaoh's gift. And it looked like through Abram's crazy plan, yeah, he came out ahead. But it caused a rift in his family. It caused the Egyptian servant to be there so she could have a child, Hagar, whose child's name was Ishmael, who fought intensely with Isaac, the son of promise who came later, who still to this very day, there's animosity and hatred and fighting between the sons of Isaac, the nation of Israel, and the sons of Ishmael, all the Arab nations around. So what looked like a blessing in the beginning, because of Abraham's really cool plan, turned out not to be such a great blessing. So we see that it's not such a good thing. And most important of all to me is that God keeps his promises. We look at this. No one can stand in the way of God's will. We can be perfectly confident if God makes a promise, he will keep it. God made a promise to Abram, and he brought that about regardless of the difficulties Abram had. He made sure that his word was fulfilled. His promises are guaranteed. Whenever God makes a promise to us, we know, doesn't matter what the circumstances look like, God will keep his word. Father, thank you so much